Afternoon. I'm Dennis Patterson, Senator for Nunavut, and I'm honored to be asked to moderate this discussion this afternoon. This is a discussion around the challenge Canada is currently grappling with in developing new relations with Aboriginal peoples, which the current Prime Minister has said is no relationship is more important to than their relationship with Aboriginal people. So it's the challenge of reconciling entrenched Aboriginal rights in the Constitution with the aspirations of Aboriginal people in governance within the Federation. We have recently been blessed with two books that discuss this issue. Nested Federalism and Inuit Governance in the Canadian Arctic, published by UBC Press, and Umingmak, Stuart Hodgson and the Birth of the Modern Arctic, published by Tidewater Press. And two of the authors are here with us today, Professor Gary Wilson and Mr. Jake Ootes. And both books examine the evolution of currently operating models of governance in Arctic regions with significant Aboriginal populations in either a territory, in this case the NWT, or provinces, in this case in Nunavut, Quebec, and Nunavut in Newfoundland and Labrador within the federal Canadian system. So I'm anxious to hear from participants who are joining us today, and welcome you all. And I'd be delighted to hear your comments or your questions, but we will have a limited time, around 3 questions that we'll be asking the authors to comment on in the course of this discussion. To ask a question, you can send a message on the chat line or the question and answer icon, and you'll be recognized. Again, I'd ask you to keep this as brief as possible so everyone can participate. So we're going to begin with the first of 3 questions that will be posed to the authors. The first question, and we'll start off with this, is how did various models of self-government evolve in the Northwest Territories and the 2 Inuit regions in Nunavut and Nunavut? So I'd like to invite the authors each to begin to answer that question, beginning with Gary Wilson, and I'd like you to keep this to about 4 minutes each. How did various models of self-government involve in the 3 regions, Inuit regions in your book, Gary? Please.
Well, thank you very much, Senator Patterson, for hosting this event, and to the press for organizing it. I'm here in Prince George in northern BC on a beautiful fall day on the traditional territory of the Tsahlekle Nation, where I live and work, and very happy to be able to chat with you today. The first part of the book really tackles this question of how these 3 nested regions and their governance structures evolved over the past 5 decades. For those of you who aren't familiar with the concept of nested regions, these are regions that are located, autonomous regions located within existing provinces and territories. So the 3 regions we look at in the book are Nunavut in northern Quebec, Nunatsiavut in northern Labrador, and the Inuvialuit settlement region in Northwest Territories. And I think the most important point, or the first point to talk about, is that these regions emerged out of the comprehensive land claims agreements that were negotiated at different points in time between representatives of Inuit peoples and representatives of the Crown. And the reason why we think this is important is because of the broader institutional context in which these agreements evolved. And they affected the evolution of the self-government regimes in each of these regions. And what we particularly note is the kind of federal rules that were in place around what could and could not go into a self-government agreement or into a land claims agreement when the land claims agreements were signed. So for example, a quick example is when the Inuit of Nunavut negotiated their land claims agreement, the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement with the Cree in the mid-1970s. The rule was, the federal rule was that you could not negotiate self-government at the same time as a land claims agreement. You had to do that after. So you had to finalize your land claim agreement first and then move on to self-government negotiations. So really that kind of set Nunavut up. It gave Nunavut a specific administrative structure, but it didn't give it self-government. If you fast forward to the kind of early 2000s when the Inuit of Nunavut negotiated their land claims agreement, at that time the rules had changed and Indigenous groups could negotiate simultaneously a land claim agreement and a self-government agreement. And that's exactly what the Inuit of Nunavut did. They included a chapter on self-government in their land claims agreement, and that's why they have the Nunavut government now. And that was sort of just an illustration, I think, of how the institutions, the rules and the norms and the values that kind of govern political behavior affected the development of these regions. Another important point, I think, to point out is that all three regions, the kind of process started when major resource development projects were either proposed or underway. And what that did is it mobilized Inuit peoples to kind of oppose those projects or to make sure that their lands were protected from those projects. And those projects posed a threat, I think, to the traditional lands and the ways of life of Inuit, and that political mobilization was really, really important. And it kind of it was a really important part of training a whole new generation of Inuit leaders. They sort of cut their political teeth in those negotiations around the land claims agreements. And then went on later on in life, people like Zebedee Umingmak and Charlie Watt in Nunavut, and there's many others who I could mention, but they went on to play important leadership roles in their regions. Lastly, I would say that there's, we can't forget the importance of key individuals. I've already mentioned the Inuit leaders that came to the fore during this time. But also the non-Indigenous politicians who either kind of moved the process forward when it seemed to be stuck, or maybe served as a barrier to self-government and self-government negotiations. So those are kind of some of the things that we focus on in the first part of the book, which looks at the evolution of self-government in these regions. Thanks
very much, Gary. Jake. Gary has just mentioned the importance of individuals in evolving new models of governance in the Arctic. Your book focuses on an individual who you worked with in the very early stages of the location of the Northwest Territories government, moving it from the colonial remote administration in Ottawa to a territorial capital in Yellowknife. So I'm interested in asking you, how did things evolve in the Northwest Territories in the time that you write about?
Well, first of all, thank you, Senator Patterson, for moderating this session. I appreciate it very much. I want to thank Gary Wilson as well with his wonderful book to be here today with us. I'll provide a bit of background to years before that took place in the 1960s, the mid-1960s and into the 1970s. And my book deals with that period of time. The federal government in about 1964 decided to start to work on Arctic policy. And they appointed a commission called the Carruthers Commission to look at the future of government in the Northwest Territories. And that commission did extensive touring of communities throughout the Arctic did a lot of research, spoke to a lot of people in communities and so forth, and formulated the report. One of the recommendations in that was that government services be provided on an equal basis to all Northern citizens. And they stated that services should not be provided along ethnic or racial lines. That report resulted in the naming of a new capital for the Northwest Territories. The capital at that time was Ottawa. That's where the civil service was located. And the Yellowknife, of course, was named the new capital. The commissioner's position was replaced from Ben Sieverts to Stuart Hodgson. Hodgson was a former labor union leader out of Vancouver. He'd worked for the IWA and had been very active in that. And he was the one that, when he became commissioner, moved the government of the Northwest Territories from Ottawa to Yellowknife. The north of that era, of course, was very, very undeveloped. It wasn't part of the Canadian mainstream. There were very few services within the communities, and those services that were there were very, very much in need of upgrading and improved services, in other words. The housing situation, the health situation, education. There were no roads within the communities, let alone to the communities, no transportation to the communities other than sea lift. And so he quickly realized that in order to tackle what the North was all about, he went around to the communities each year. And I traveled with him during that period of time in the formative years. And he would listen to the communities, and in many cases, it was the first time a community would come together for a meeting in some of the situations. And he then would go back to headquarters, where he concentrated on the development of government departments, which were started from scratch in many cases. There had been a Department of Education, for example, but rudimentary so. And he developed the Department of Local Government, the Department of Social Services, mostly in the service area, economic development as an example. Now, when we were in these communities, sorry, I got to just catch something here. When we were in the communities, he would encourage people to get involved on the local level. Community administrators were in place, and he would tell the community administrators, who were basically civil servants, you have to work your way out of a job. That's what I, as commissioner, am doing over the next 10 years. And I want you to start handing over control of the community council, if that existed, and pardon me, I've got issues here. Just got to interrupt here for a second. And from there, of course, he transmitted, as I mentioned, information back to headquarters. Additionally, he established in the regional headquarters in the Baffin, in the Keewatin, in Nunavut, and in Fort Smith. And that brought people closer to the service to the community levels, because headquarters, of course, it came from Ottawa to Yellowknife, which was a good move. But then he foresaw that services needed to be provided closer to the people, to the communities themselves. And of course, the North was very diverse. I mean, we had 50-some communities spread over 1,300,000 square miles, and each area was very distinct. So he foresaw that services had to be tailored in each particular area. And through that groundwork of him going to the communities, him encouraging the involvement of the people in the communities to get involved in the administration and at the political level. That allowed people to, and it started the road to involvement of Aboriginal people at the regional level and later on at the territorial level. So that's sort of the background to it. And in question 2, I'll get into some details of what Hodgson accomplished during that period of time.
Thank you very much, both Jake and Gary. You have just mentioned involvement of Aboriginal peoples, Jake, and the regions that you and your colleagues have written about, Gary, all have high proportions of Inuit in those regions. So I'd like to ask you to, not seeing any questions or comments yet at this point, I'd like to ask you to plunge right into the most important issue facing Canada today, which is how do we build governments, especially new forms of governance, that will reflect and respect Aboriginal rights and values, including all important areas of language and culture, while at the same time interfacing with provinces and the federal government. So still wanting to invite questions and comments after this. I will ask, beginning with Jake, you to comment on how, and of course, Stu Hodgson was basically a Southerner and a non-Aboriginal person. How did he, in that era, encourage respect for and engagement with Aboriginal people through what you've described as his belief in a public government model? How did that happen? First Jake, and then I'll call on Gary.
Well, he certainly believed in a public government system that the people of the North could participate in that. And he foresaw that the groundwork, first of all, had to be established. As I mentioned, the development of government departments was his priority. Then it was the development within the regions. And he then went out to the communities, which he did right from the start. And he I wouldn't say educated people on it, but he did talk to people a lot about the purpose of the territorial government, what it was all about, how it could benefit people, and so forth. Through the government departments, he encouraged people, as I mentioned earlier, to get involved first at the community level. As I mentioned, they had administrators in each community, and they were lord and master in those days, it seemed. And his viewpoint was that can't continue. They have to work their way out. They have to teach people how to become administrators. They have to teach people how to become members of committees, housing committees, social committees, and so forth, and then to be part of the community administrative system. He, through the Department of Local Government, encouraged the creation of small settlements to develop their community councils. So it was a settlement level, a hamlet level, town level, village, town, city level. And each level had more power. And he foresaw that through that system, people would learn, people would become aware of their political responsibilities and the administrative responsibilities. And that's what resulted eventually in a lot of these community people coming on stream at the regional level. In other words, in the Baffin region, in the Keewatin, etc., Fort Smith, Nunavut regions, and so forth. Then they got involved at the territorial level, and over time, we foresaw that Aboriginal people became the dominant membership in the Legislative Assembly as an example. So that's how I saw development of people becoming involved in the administration, in the political system.
Jake, those folks were all, their first languages were, I think, up to 7 Dene languages and Inuktitut. How did, with all the cultural values laden in Aboriginal languages, how did the emerging territorial government deal with that significant language and cultural barrier?
Yeah, absolutely. It was, as you mentioned, quite significant. And whenever we traveled around, as an example, people would, of course, speak, most people were unilingual, so we would call on someone in the audience to translate, which was a question of capability, a question of accuracy, and so forth. So I foresaw a problem with that, and I was spurred on by some of the MLAs of that time, Brian Pearson as an example. And we established an interpreter corps, and the first year was 12 members were hired from every language in the Northwest Territories. We put them through a 1-year training program. They spent a week on a military ship, a week at headquarters, a week at the UN, United Nations to see their translation services, Ottawa translation at Parliament, and so forth. They spent a week on Work Arctic project where they were extending the highway from Fort Simpson up the Arctic coast. So in this way, they became government employees within our system, and they were able to transmit to other government departments, government employees, senior management, and so forth, what the culture of each particular area might have been when people were dealing with those communities, those areas. In addition, of course, they provided translation services. And out of that came some significant individuals. Betty Brewster, as an example, tremendous translator. When Betty came on board, one of the things I lived by was I didn't care about their education level. I wondered about their enthusiastic level. And all of these people, we had 12 of them, they all became predominant leaders. Now, before that, I decided that we would identify Aboriginal information officers, different from translation and interpreters. Those translation officers came into headquarters and in the Baffin region headquarters and in Keewatin. Peter Ernick was one, John Amagwalik was another, James Arvaluk, and Ray Sanfrere. All of these people became eventually spokespeople to develop Aboriginal organizations. Sorry, I carried on a little bit there.
Thank you, Jake. So Gary, I'll ask you the same question about how the models that you and your colleagues studied showed respect for and engagement with the Aboriginal rights and values of the majority population in those regions. Please.
Thank you, Senator Patterson. And you rightly pointed out that this is a work of 3 authors, Chris Alcantara and Thierry Rodin from Western University and Laval University were my co-authors. And yeah, I mean, this is a very interesting question. How are the models working and how do they respect Aboriginal rights and values? I think the answer to the first question, how are they working? I think it really depends on your perspective and the region in question. I would see the models that have been evolving in Inuvialuit and Nunavut as maybe more means to an end. They're interim models that will likely change in the future, as opposed to the Nunatsiavut model, which is more of a finished product, although very much a work in progress, I think, in terms of the powers and authorities that it exercises. In the second part of the book, we assess sort of the governance of these regions and in some key policy areas. And you've already pointed out the importance of language. So one of the policy areas that we chose was education policy. This was something that the Inuit leaders in these regions were telling us was really important to them. And I think what we're trying to do is really understand how much autonomy these regions actually have. They have varying degrees of self-government, varying sort of institutional structures, but do they actually exercise autonomy? Do they have decision-making capacity? And or is it really just the territorial or provincial and federal governments that are making the decisions here? So one of the things we tried to do by looking at the sort of their activities in these policy areas is try to figure out where they're able to make decisions that are separate from other levels of government. And I think there's some evidence to suggest in all three regions that they have a degree of control over their territory. We see what we call instances of multi-level governance. Although this kind of governance is still very much restricted by other levels of government, provincial, federal, territorial, but particularly territorial and provincial, I would say, because many of the policy areas that Inuit want to control, things like healthcare, education, social services, those are all provincial or territorial areas of jurisdiction. So that's where the sort of interface, I think, with other levels of government comes into play. They have to sort of negotiate these arrangements with other levels of government, but in particular the provincial and territorial governments. And I'd be really interested to hear what you and Jake think about things like devolution. So devolution has occurred fairly recently in the Northwest Territories over a period of time in areas like resource development and so on. You know, is the territorial government, you know, reluctant to further devolve authority to Indigenous governments that are coming into being as a result of these land claim agreements that are being signed and these self-government arrangements that are coming into to place. So yeah, so that's sort of what our book looks at. The second part of the book looks at. Do these models respect Inuit values? And I mean, you could make the argument, I think, that you know, these governments look very much like Western governments, right? The Nunatsiavut government has departments and ministries, and you know, it kind of, in many respects, looks and feels like a Western model of government. But I think there are some aspects of these governments which are you know, kind of respect Inuit values. For example, you don't often see political parties being very active in these governments, and that's political parties are kind of a Western innovation. The other thing is, I mean, you often, one of the most important actors in some of these regions are the development corporations that have come into being. These are the Makivik Corporation and the Inuvialuit Regional Corporation. These are the organizations that represent the beneficiaries to the land claims agreements, and they don't answer to other levels of government. They are autonomous actors and very powerful organizations within the regions. And one of their mandates really is to support Inuit culture and values, alongside you know, trying to ensure the kind of health and well-being economically of these regions. So I think if you look at it in terms of autonomy, you know, those organizations do play a very important role, and they are controlled by Inuit from top to bottom.
Thank you, Gary. I'm delighted to see we have a comment, and I'm sure Ken Harper won't mind me sharing this with participants. Ken himself being an accomplished author, historian, linguist, and entrepreneur, and I probably missed out a few of his amazing attributes. Ken says he doesn't have a question, but a comment for Jake, which is, I'm enjoying your book immensely. I've been wishing for a long time that someone would do a book on the Hodgson years, a very important time in the North. You are the ideal person to do it. I knew Stu and saw him in action many times, especially in Arctic Bay. I've seen bureaucrats having to scramble to make good on the off-the-cuff promises he often made at community events. I know that the Inuit in Arctic Bay loved him. he got things done for the benefit of the people. Thanks for that contribution, Ken. Gary, we've talked about how provincial governments and even territorial governments that get devolved province-like authorities can be jealous about keeping hold of their power. And sometimes they have to be sued to get their attention. This happened, of course, in the James Bay in northern Quebec era, when there was a famous injunction on the dam. I think in Nunavut, the Labrador Inuit sued the provincial government over Muskrat Falls, and there's been recently a landmark decision in the Supreme Court of Newfoundland about royalty rights to the Voisey's Bay project, in which the judge, I think, very much scolded the provincial government for having not honored the obligations of the land claim agreement to share royalties and engage with Inuit. Would you comment about how Inuit overcome these tendencies of governments to hold on to their powers?
I think Inuit have demonstrated that they are very patient and very pragmatic when it comes to dealing with other levels of government. You have to you have to understand that these governance arrangements and often the land claims take decades to negotiate, and often under duress as well. I mean, the Inuit leaders that are involved in negotiating these land claim agreements are kind of have their backs to the wall. If you look at what was going on with the James Bay Northern Quebec Agreement negotiations, I mean, the construction had already started. It was a reality, and the Cree and Inuit were really negotiating under duress. The same is true for some of the other groups. I think that in terms of holding other levels of government accountable, there is an issue that comes up with in terms of the implementation of treaties and whether governments are actually doing what they said they would do in the treaty or what they agreed to. I think that's a huge issue within all of these regions and further afield. It's one thing for a treaty to say that the Indigenous group can have authority over X, Y, Z, but whether that's actually implemented or downloaded to Indigenous governments, that's another thing. The other issue that comes up, of course, is capacity and the ability of Indigenous governments to take on new powers. We've seen that in the regions that we look at. In Nunavut, for example, there was a reluctance, I think, on the part of some of the Nunavut government officials to be too quick in terms of drawing down powers that were outlined in the treaty. And they've been very, very sort of patient and careful about doing that. One good example in our study was the issue of housing. So when we first started looking at this and doing the research, housing was, is a problem in many different regions across Canada. But the Nunavut government didn't have any intention of having its own housing authority. But over the course of the research, the several year period we did the research, as the situation changed, they developed the capacity. They felt comfortable with, drawing down those powers that were outlined in the treaty. And by the end of the research, just before the book came out, they created a housing authority. So now they kind of control what's going on in the region in terms of housing. So yeah, that would be my answer to that question.
Thank you. So Jake, Stu Hodgson is gone now, but you were, I would say, probably privileged to be a cabinet minister, an MLA and a cabinet minister in the NWT government some years later. And you were there when the diamond rush came into the territories and diamond companies built 4 mines, I believe, in the NWT, and they also negotiated devolution. Can you tell us how the territorial government, since Hodgson's era, reached out to Aboriginal people, the Aboriginal majority, and how successful that you think that might have been?
Well, just dealing with resource development as an example, which stimulated the question of devolution. And dealing with the diamond mines as one example specific. And I should mention too, Gary has mentioned a couple of areas here. There are always individuals who spearhead these things. And I agree with that. And that land claims take years and years of negotiation. It doesn't happen overnight. The diamond mines came to the fore when I was first elected, and I was a champion of getting the diamond mines established because I foresaw that the North needed an economy, and it just struggled without having a big project of that nature. And as a government, we decided that there would have to be benefits for Northerners in that. The spin-off, of course, became that the Tlicho formed their organization to seek benefits from the development of the diamond mines. As a government, we said there needs to be 60% Northern employment, and 50% of that have to be of Aboriginal people. There had to be specific benefits for Northern businesses, especially Aboriginal businesses. That, as I mentioned, that stimulated the Tlicho to start forming their organization to deal with that massive development there. And the Tlicho government came about as a result. Now, again, we're dealing with people that became leaders from early days. James Washi, as an example, you know, today he's the speaker of the Tlicho government. And there were other projects that stimulated from there. The Tlicho government has built a dam that services the Yellowknife area and so forth. And that's all because they were able to gain control over development within their territory. The devolution situation did take almost decades. There was back in the, I believe it was in the 80s, discussions had started on that. Then the Jim Burke report was the first to deal with that whole issue of development happening in the territories. And from there, the Aboriginal Summit was formed. The Jim Burke report, by the way, was a collaboration between the government of the Northwest Territories and the Aboriginal Summit, which had just come into formation. As the years rolled by, and when I was in government in 1996, they dealt with the constitutional development and land claim issues, both jointly between the territorial government and the Aboriginal Summit. When I became a cabinet minister, I was a representative of cabinet with the Aboriginal Summit to deal with a new constitution to be developed for the Northwest Territories. And no, it didn't proceed at that point, but it sent a message to, I think, a lot of the Aboriginal groups and Aboriginal people that we were willing to sit down and talk. And as we've learned, and Hodgson was the perfect example of that, it's hard work to deal with negotiations. It's hard work. You have to be understanding, you have to be compassionate, you have to be understanding, and you have to be willing to concede things. I shouldn't say concede as much as to recognize that there is a right by people negotiating on the other side of the table, and respect for that. And I think that was one of the things that I saw in the territorial government that was there by all of the political people, that we needed to respect those people that were part of organizations attempting to have devolution happen, have land claim issues settled, and so forth. Now, our government was consensus. Yes, it's different than what is experienced in the South, but it worked wonderfully. It worked wonderfully because it does have a limited number of people involved, of course. But the consensus style is certainly something that other organizations should look at, other jurisdictions should look at as well, especially with committees and so forth.
Now, we're getting to a question that I think is very important in this country today, and we just have to look at the rail blockades of the past year and the polarization that seems to be occurring over Aboriginal rights. I'd like to ask both authors to turn to what lessons our experience that you've described in the North can have for the rest of Canada. And I want to point out that in other jurisdictions in Southern Canada, there aren't Aboriginal majorities that are pressuring governments to show respect and engagement as we have had in the NWT in particular. Nor do we have the resource projects that give Aboriginal peoples leverage in the three regions that we've discussed. It was oil and gas in the Beaufort and the Mackenzie. It was the James Bay project in Nunavut. It was the Voisey's Bay project in Newfoundland and in Nunavut. Those triggers are not always available in provincial jurisdictions in the South. So bearing that in mind, I'd like to ask, beginning with Gary, I'd like to ask you, what can Canada and other Aboriginal peoples struggling with these challenges learn from what you've discovered in the Arctic regions?
Well, as you pointed out, I think it's really in some ways difficult to answer this question because each situation and context is unique, and what works for Inuit or individual Inuit regions, for example, may not work for First Nations in British Columbia. But I think, one of the positive things that we can say about this is that, in the story of these regions, we see a gradual evolution in the thinking of non-Indigenous governments from not wanting to deal at all with reconciliation and Indigenous self-government if we go back more than 50 years ago, and not wanting to deal with the challenges faced by these regions, to a kind of a recognition that something needs to be done. And I'm hopeful that sort of gradual evolution will continue over time, and that will facilitate reconciliation. But it is a very slow, often glacial process, and realizing that the challenges that face these regions and communities within them are very current and need to be addressed. That can often be frustrating, I think, for Indigenous leaders, the sort of glacial pace of change on the part of other levels of government. I think that certainly, we can have respect for Inuit leaders and the way that they've conducted themselves throughout the whole long and complicated process. It's kind of a model for other Aboriginal groups. I've referred to, in other research, I've referred to some of the Inuit leaders that are people like Sheila Watt-Cloutier and Mary Simon as being rooted cosmopolitans. And this is a term I borrowed from a sociologist called Sidney Tarrow. And he in turn developed it in response to Lenin's term, rootless cosmopolitans, which is kind of a criticism of these international intellectuals that existed in the Soviet Union. But they're rooted cosmopolitans in the sense that they're perfectly comfortable and very adept at existing within an international environment and sort of promoting the rights of Inuit in the international context. But at the same time, they draw strength from their Inuit culture and the Inuit values. So I think that's really important for other Indigenous leaders thinking about that, right? You have to be able to sort of live in both of these different worlds. One of the things that I think Inuit are very good at is collaboration, and there's a certain strength in numbers. We talk about these individual Inuit regions as separate entities, but over the last 30, 40 years, Inuit have kind of banded together at the national level too. They created the Inuit Tapirut Kanatami, which is the national Inuit organization. And that in turn has led, that organization sort of speaks for the Inuit collective in Canada. The most recent development, which we do mention in the book, is the creation of the Inuit Crown Partnership Committee, which is a very high level committee that meets twice a year. It brings Inuit leaders in contact with senior cabinet ministers, and even the prime minister attends these meetings. And that has been really important in terms of projecting an Inuit voice. So that idea of unity and not sort of being individual groups, but rather coming together as a collective is a really important aspect. I know that it's very different for First Nations, for example. There are many more First Nations than there are Inuit groups, and that kind of collective approach can often be very difficult, I think. But that would be one aspect which I would emphasize is being this kind of strength in numbers.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay, I'll leave it at that.
I just want to encourage participants to ask any questions of these accomplished authors that are here, or make any comments. So we will eagerly receive those. But in the meantime, and thanks for that, Gary, I'd like to turn to Jake and ask you, Jake, do you think that Southern Canada has lessons to learn from the experiences that you write about and that you've lived in the NWT in terms of relations with Aboriginal peoples?
Very definitely so. One of the advantages we did have in the Northwest Territories was that it was a predominantly Indigenous territory. They made up 2/3 of the population. That may be changing over time. The other factor that, or a factor that entered into that was a lot more people got involved politically, administratively, at the local level, regional level, and territorial level. Gary points out in his book too, it has taken actors to spearhead movement forward in developing these organizations that exist today. Well, in the Northwest Territories, we through the involvement initially at an administrative level, I saw it in my department that I had. We eventually saw the evolution of people moving up in the ladder politically. Peter Ernick was a very good example of that. James Washee is an example of that. He also had been the head of the Indian Brotherhood of the Northwest Territories, of course. And so his leadership capabilities continued to develop. And of course, in later years, he became involved with the Tlicho Agreement. And Peter Ernick himself became the first cabinet minister in the government of the Northwest Territories. Back in 1960, whatever it was, 1975, sorry. And anyway, it developed a lot of leaders in the Northwest Territories, and they took that experience and encouraged other leaders in the North to formulate organizations to deal with their issues. I think one of the things that came out of the North was there was a trust developed between the Aboriginal people and the government itself. Yes, there were conflicts. Yes, there were differences of opinion, but there was trust. And an example of that was the ongoing negotiations by the Aboriginal Summit and in the Mackenzie Valley and the government of the Northwest Territories. And then it resulted in the devolution process at the end of the day. There needs to be definition, I think, and the North is a good example of how to do that. Recognition of languages, Aboriginal languages. We passed legislation to recognize all of the languages in the Northwest Territories, a total of 9 languages. There was recognition of culture as an example. And we did that through various means. Arctic Winter Games and so forth, but the establishment of the Northern Heritage Center in Yellowknife, you can't call it, in those days you couldn't call it a museum, and Hodgson foresaw, okay, we'll call it a heritage center, and he got away with it, got even federal money to build it. A repository, in other words, of a lot of the culture that was part of the North. Economic development is an issue, I think the biggest one. And again, I refer to it in my book, but also Gary refers to it in their book, that big projects bring people together to say we need some benefits from that. And the North has been a perfect example of how to share. The devolution agreement did that. It was a sharing between the federal government, the provincial government, or the territorial government, and the Aboriginal governments that exist in the Northwest Territories. There has to be trust amongst people. There has to be recognition of where the people are coming from. And I think the North can teach that to Southern Canada. The other thing that Hodgson did was he ensured that the public government did have the ability to provide the services. And one of the problems that I foresee developing, and maybe there, is when organizations, yes, they want to have more and more control over programs and so forth, but you got to watch the fragmentation. For instance, health funding. You know, the territorial government has the capacity and should have the capacity and the capability to deliver health services in a first-class fashion. But if you start to divert money from the federal government to Aboriginal organizations to develop healthcare systems, you're really fragmenting from the central government that could provide it. The process should be from the federal government to the territorial to the Aboriginal governments. And the same with education, same with culturally and so forth. Languages, yes, I agree. There should be could be direct funding, but it is something that I've felt that, you know, if you fragment too much, people do suffer out of it. And it takes time to build capacity. It takes time to build capability, for instance. Big industrial projects are a real opportunity. But governments need to recognize in the South that when they are on traditional lands, governments need to be flexible. They cannot just bowl over organizations and say, no, this is the way it is going to be. Vossey's Bay is a good example of that, you know, where the government was not fair. They negotiated behind it. I suppose it was not known by the Aboriginal organization that the provincial government negotiated with the company to build a refinery not on the territorial lands, but away from it, and to allow the company to write off the asset value, which impinged upon the return to the Aboriginal groups. And so the distrust starts to set in. And that has to be watched by provincial governments. And I think the North is a good example of how trust has been built and local people have been involved, respect for their traditions, for languages, etc.
Thank you, Jake. Still waiting for questions or comments. But in the meantime, Gary, I'll ask you a couple of things based on what you've just said. You talked about provinces and governments starting to gradually be inclined to do something about these problems that are in some cases paralyzing regions, often over resource development, but increasingly over other issues like policing and healthcare. We've seen graphic examples in those areas just in recent months. What role did leadership from non-Aboriginals play in developments in the three regions you folks studied? I'm thinking of at the provincial level in particular.
Well, I think they definitely played a role. The different Inuit groups in each region, the leaders, over time developed very close relations with provincial and territorial officials, in part because, as I mentioned earlier, many of the policy areas that they were interested in controlling or having authority over were provincial or territorial jurisdictions. So that relationship between leaders at the provincial territorial level and the Inuit level started to become really important and built up over time. When we were in Nunavut speaking to Inuit leaders and officials there, they sort of commented on this notion of relationship building and how at the provincial level, kind of the same individuals stayed in place for longer periods, whereas at the federal level, there was a lot of movement and you'd be dealing with different people all the time. So that ability to foster trust and relations wasn't there as much at the federal level. I think, if you look at somewhere like Nunavut, for example, the region of Nunavut itself, the territory, only became part of Quebec in the early 1900s. But for the first 50 years of Nunavut being part of Quebec really, the government really wanted nothing to do with the region, and in fact went to the Supreme Court with the federal government to argue over who would actually be responsible for Inuit. And it wasn't until the 1960s, people like René Lévesque, for example, kind of regained interest in the region and saw that there were issues and problems there. And Lévesque was, a very interesting character in Canadian politics generally, but he was the one who wanted to start to address some of these issues in Nunavut. There may have been a ulterior motive there, right? The provincial government was looking to northern Quebec for hydroelectric development, but at the same time, I think there's a very genuine sort of perspective on what he saw as the neglect of people living in that region and the need for governments to step in and do something.
I think you gave Brian Tobin credit for jump-starting negotiations, which included self-government in Nunavut as well, Gary. Yeah. Yes, thank you. And I'd like to ask you as well, you praised the Inuit for having a collaborative approach. And I think you also in your book referred to their patient pragmatism, which I noted. And I've heard other descriptions of a benign approach to confrontation. Or would you give advice to First Nations folks about maybe taking a lesson from the Inuit about how to engage in ways that avoid confrontation? Is there something to learn from the Inuit experience? Because it's the Inuit that have built these models that, imperfect as they are, evolving as they are. It's the Inuit that have managed to, and of course in Nunavut, persuade the federal government to give them their own territory, in fact, in their homeland. Do Inuit have lessons to teach their Aboriginal brothers and sisters in the rest of Canada?
I mean, I wouldn't give advice to First Nations, but I'm not in that position to do so. But and I think that, as I pointed out earlier, I think the context is very different for Inuit. I mean, you're talking about often regions where the vast majority of the population is Inuit, and that really makes a difference. Even if you introduce a public government, like the government of Nunavut, for example, or the kind of administrative bodies in Nunavik, de facto it is controlled by Inuit, right? Whereas if you look further south, First Nations with settlement and colonialism, that is often not the case. So I think that introduces an air of tension into the relationships between Indigenous peoples and governments and industry that maybe is not present to the same extent in Inuit regions.
Okay, thank you. I note that at the end of the your book, both of your books are optimistic about accomplishments and challenges, and I wonder if you would comment on what were disappointing in the progress that you've outlined. What there were accomplishments, but what is left to be done? And I see we have a comment as well, and maybe I'll just refer to that as well, and it's possibly a little bit of a challenging aspect as well. And this is to Gary. In light of your reference to capacity and the evolutionary process of the Nunavut Inuit in drawing down responsibility, is a term I think you use in your book, for example, through a housing commission, can you comment on whether the concept of nested federalism imposes or implies any duty or responsibility on the part of the federal and provincial governments to help develop self-government capacities among nested Indigenous governments? Ultimately, the real capacity issue is financial. Does the concept help Indigenous governments with respect to access to financial resources and the development of capacities to draw down jurisdiction?
That's a really important question. I think we can think about capacity in many ways, but obviously financial capacity is a major impediment to dealing with the challenges faced by these regions. I think in some ways, in speaking of nested federalism, in some ways these regions are kind of locked into a pre-existing system of government. And I think for some that's disappointing, right? I mean, to get back to your comment about disappointment, these regions I don't think will ever be fully sovereign like provinces or territories. Maybe that will change at some point in the future, but in the short to medium term, they will always be parts of existing provinces and territories, and that it complicates their relationship with other levels of government, and in some ways it limits their ability to develop. But just on the point of financial capacity, I think one of the things that we've seen in all three of these regions is that by signing a land claims agreement, that provided them with some financial capacity, and that capacity is now managed by development corporations in the case of Nunavut and Nunavut, and by the Nunatsiavut government in the case of Nunatsiavut. And that, that provides some resources that for them to deal with some of these challenges that they face. But I think there's always a reluctance, as I mentioned, about drawing down powers too quickly and taking on too much. And it has to do with financial capacity. I think in some ways it has to do with human capacity, administrative capacity, and other forms of capacity. But finances are obviously at the heart of this.
Thank you. I think that you've talked a lot about human capacity, human resource capacity, and that brings us to education. And there's some pretty alarming figures about the lack of successful high school graduation in those regions. Jake, you were education minister. Is education a challenge that governments have to find a way to achieve more success, that is a barrier to further and fuller involvement of Aboriginal people in governance?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I don't know whether I'm on screen or not.
Yes. Go ahead, Jake.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Absolutely. There's challenges there, and what I found during my time was a process of can we devolve responsibility of education to the regions. We had educational boards throughout the Northwest Territories, as there were health boards and so forth. They were not handed over necessarily to the Aboriginal organizations, but eventually, in the case of the Tlicho, that now is operated by the Tlicho government with standards set by the territorial government. On a personal note there, what I found was there was concern on the home front, and interestingly enough, I would go to communities and speak about this from time to time. I spoke at the All Chiefs Conference as well, to say that education, of course, everyone recognized the importance of educating their young people, and there were systems in place to help advance them through public education and then into higher education. But importantly, what I found was that individuals, people, were somewhat reluctant to become involved with their children's education. And I spoke to the chiefs about this from time to time, to make our schools more friendly, to have people come into the schools to participate, because it was looked at as a building that perhaps they weren't allowed to be, it wasn't used for public purposes or anything of that nature. And I think there was recognition that everyone played a role. And I did ask the chiefs to encourage people to become involved in the school system for whatever capability they had. Elders to speak before children about their culture, language, and so forth. The territorial government has one of the best higher education support systems in the country, the Student Financial Assistance Program. So once they can reach that level of high school graduation, there is a very, very good system in place for them to, without incurring debt to a great degree to get through the school system, through university, trades, whatever it may be. But it's at the lower levels that the challenge still lies. And mind you, it's already 20 years since I was there. But in my time, it was definitely a challenge. And graduation levels were not at what was necessary.
Thanks, Jake. I've just got another question from Helen, and I think it's asking the panelists to look forward to perspectives on the future of governance in the North, challenges and opportunities. And I think I have to observe that, Gary, in your colleague's book, you point out that there were hopes to have an amalgamated regional governments in the Inuit regional settlement area and in Nunavut, which still have not been realized, even though there are development corporations, there are land claims institutions like the IRC that are playing important roles in governance, but particularly in Nunavut, massive amounts of energy and time have been devoted to trying to establish a coordinated, holistic regional government, and still no progress. So can I turn to you, Gary, in particular to ask you, how do you see things evolving going forward in terms of Inuit governance, challenges and opportunities?
I think in those two regions, sort of very carefully and incrementally, there's a number of reasons why the kind of process of creating an amalgamated government has not been successful in Nunavut. It's actually been rejected in two referenda by the regional inhabitants themselves. And I think part of it is that there's a concern that it's not devolving enough authority to the regional government, that the agreement wouldn't devolve enough authority. But at the same time, and it kind of gets back to the point I was making earlier about how do institutions influence the development of a self-government regime. And in the case of Nunavut, you have three kind of administrative bodies that exist at the regional level. You have a school board, a health board, and a kind of a regional government, like a supra-municipal government. And those have been in place ever since the mid-1970s. And in some ways, and there's been evidence of this, is that some of those boards, particularly the school board, has kind of resisted this amalgamation process, right? It came out very much against amalgamation in the early 2000s when they were trying to develop that. And I think what happens is that these institutions are created and they become, very set in stone, entrenched. And they have their relationships with, different provincial ministries, and they're happy with the way, they're in charge of their particular policy area. And there's a kind of reluctance to kind of put them all together into one government and just make them government departments. So I think, that's frustrating, but at the same time, it's also an important message is that, when creating self-government, you really need the people's approval to do that. That's a really important part of the process. So if they're creating something that isn't approved by the people within the region, then maybe they need to go back to the drawing board. I've seen that in my own territory in Prince George. They've also tried to create sign a land claims agreement and a self-government agreement. And twice it's failed at referendum. So, That's the way that politics works sometimes, is that, you have to keep going back and trying again.
Jake, do you want to make some comments about challenges and opportunities for future of governance in the North?
Well, from an early time on, the process of governing was consensus. And even during my time, and it had been on the table of many years, that there needed to be a look at other forms of dealing at the territorial level other than consensus. In other words, the party system. But it has never come about. And to this day, is my understanding. And I don't know whether that's a question in a lot of the communities, but it was certainly a question in the community I represented. Why can't we move to a party system? But that has difficulties because but what the lack of governing has is that there is no platform that people can identify. It isn't until the members get within the legislature that a vision is put forward. Now, I had my platform when I got elected, as I'm sure you did when you got elected, and you put that forward, and through consensus, you reach an agreement of what becomes priority of that particular government. But these are individual platforms rather than an overall vision of what a group thinks how development should take place. And that could be a role that organizations like the Aboriginal Summit, like the land claim organizations could deal with and say, these are platforms we should develop. These are issues through an election that we would like to have put forward to each of the MLAs, that they become an overall territorial wide platform, in other words. And I see that as a something that's been on a critical table for some time.
Thank you, Jake. I think Professor Graham White, who I greatly admire, has written about the consensus system in the NWT, and I think one of his theories is that the consensus system is a reflection of Aboriginal values, where people traditionally living in smaller groups or smaller communities, even nomadic groups, have had to work together and find ways of collaborating as a group to move forward, even if it's more difficult, even if it takes a longer time. So I think that's the comment really you're making is that politicizing challenges like education or housing or health is not the way to go, even for partisan governments. Maybe I'll take the liberty of making a comment on Helen's very good question about challenges ahead. And it's a subject that is covered in both your books, and that's housing. I mean, the reality is that we have third world conditions, dare I say, in housing in these regions, all of them, to lesser degrees, perhaps in, I think in Nunavut than in the other two regions where people seem to have had more success in home ownership. But, our MP in Nunavut has just done a tour this summer, and she's unveiled incredible stories of mold and disrepair and overcrowding. And I think we all know that adequate housing is a key to so many other opportunities for people. It's a key to being able to hold a job, having success in school, avoiding health problems. I mean, we just can shudder to think of what the introduction of the COVID pandemic could unleash in overcrowded housing in the north, TB, respiratory problems are higher because of overcrowded housing. So it seems to me that one of the opportunities for Canada, probably, and I think this is true really for many, many First Nations on reserve. People talk about water, but I think housing is, also a fundamental issue. One of the opportunities for Canada is to make sure that the billions of dollars that have been promised for infrastructure by the current and previous governments are allocated to providing, to eliminating the overcrowding and disrepair problems in housing in all our regions. It's a first priority, I think you said in your book, Gary, for the Nunavut government, and it should be a priority for provincial and national governments who've, I think, been left out of housing strategies in the country. So I just want to maybe chair's prerogative make that comment, and I know it's addressed in both of your books. So colleagues, I think we're coming to the end of a very interesting and wide-ranging discussion. I want to ask again and invite any questions or comments, because we'd love to hear from any participants. But in the meantime, Gary and Jake, I'll give you one last opportunity to make a comment. I think there have been years have gone into the writing of these books. Jake, I think you told me it was 40 years. Maybe I misheard you. That seems even older than you are, but your book took years. And Gary, I know that you and your co-authors did interviews, which are not easy in these remote regions. So I'd just like to ask you if you could describe a bit about the experience of producing these interesting books, and how you feel about what you might be offering to Canada in dealing with these important issues of reconciliation through your books. Gary, could you first?
Sure. Well, yeah, I mean, the problem I think with academic books is that they take so long to produce. I mean, you sort of embark on this research and you travel, in our case, travel to the regions and conduct interviews with people, and then the actual process of producing the book takes such a long time, so that almost by the time you publish the book and it comes out, it's out of date, or it reflects a snapshot in time, I think. So there's probably a lot more that could be said that's happened probably more recently on this topic. But I think what these books offer, I think they offer a perspective on how Inuit and Indigenous peoples are sort of pushing at the boundaries of the political system within Canada. And for many years, as we start the book off with, the federal system didn't recognize Indigenous peoples or Indigenous rights to self-government. It didn't even incorporate it within the federal system of government. And I think what Inuit and other Aboriginal groups are doing now is sort of, challenging that system and trying to find spaces and create spaces where they can operate as political entities. So I think that's a really important message. The other thing too is that these books, I mean, I don't expect average citizens to be reading my book on nested federalism. It really is an academic study. It's an academic book. And Jake, your book is just so wonderfully rich with stories. It's a much more sort of popular narrative of what actually went on in the Northwest Territories during the time period when you were active there. And but in the case of my book, it's an academic study. But I think what it does inform is it informs my teaching. So when I teach courses on Northern Canada and Arctic politics, or my colleagues do that, I think what we're doing is actually informing a lot of people based in the South about all of these important developments that are happening in the North and why they should be paying attention to those developments. And the hope, I think, for me is that at some point, maybe some of those students will go on to positions of authority within government, within industry, and they will, remember this information that's been presented to them, and that will start to change minds about how we deal with the challenges facing northern regions. Thank
you, Gary, for that. Jake, your book appears to be about a colorful character, Stu, or Umingmak, Muskox, as he was named by the Inuit. But in fact, on reading it, and yes, there are lots of stories, as Gary said, colorful stories about the colorful characters that the North seems to attract. But I think really underneath that all, your theme is also a serious one about developing governance and working with Aboriginal people and dealing with challenges to colonialism. And Stu was seen as an emissary of colonialism by many Aboriginal peoples, as you've described, and worked hard to overcome that. So I'd like to ask you to tell us a bit about why you wrote the book. Was it not about more than Stu Hodgson as a colorful character, but also about the evolution of a form of government that succeeded in many ways?
Well, I have to go back to my experience. As can be appreciated, we traveled an awful lot throughout the North. Hodgson was an interesting character, and I have to describe him as such because he had empathy for people, and that was because of his background. And he had a real challenge in front of him, and that was to, bring the people of the North into the modern age, into the mainstream of Canada, so to speak, so that they would have the benefits and advantages that other people elsewhere in Canada had. That is the sort of front of the story. But, when I was growing up and went to high school, our high school courses were about the Emancipation Proclamation by Jefferson in the United States. And it was about Nelson and his Navy. It had nothing to do with Canadian history. We never touched Canadian history. And it struck me that what Hodgson did and what I experienced was history. It was the changing of the North, bringing the Northwest Territories, as I said, what other people in Canada took for granted. And he fought hard for that. He built a government. He worked extremely hard, and he went through, I'm sure, a lot of times wondering whether he was making the progress he did. There were ups and downs, and I experienced that with him of emotions. It wasn't always that he could get things accomplished that he wanted to accomplish the way he wanted to accomplish it. But one little example is when we toured the communities, people would refer to themselves as E125, the old disidentification system. And Hodgson noticed that and made note of it, and he appointed Abe Uckpick, the great Abe Uckpick, and a great friend of mine and all of us, to uh, as leader of Project Surname to give people back their names. And so Abe traveled the territory to interview everybody to say, what would you like to have as your name? Now, they all had names before, but the federal government, in its wisdom of the day, decided that they would be numbers. Well, Hodgson got rid of that. As an example. And I think that is my book. I wanted to record some things in it that would be lost to history, that would perhaps not be remembered as it actually happened. So it was important for me to record my impressions of what the communities were like in those days, what the structure of government was, how it was built, and it all revolved around Stu Hodgson and my own experiences. As I mentioned, I just happened to be a very fortunate person that headed up an information department, and we were fortunate to get some great leaders come in to my department who eventually became great leaders in the North. And, in the South, if I were to comment on that part of it, to digress for a moment from my book, I think that lesson should be learned in the southern provinces. There needs to be recognition of Aboriginal languages, tremendous support provided for that. I think that the important things are, I saw and I dealt with housing issues, economic issues, education, health, social services and so forth, but also more importantly, the industrial development in communities, in the territory, which people could take advantage of or at least negotiate participation in. Was the book easy to write? No, it took some time to kind of develop it's a nonfiction, of course. It's not an academic book. It's experiences that I went through, and it's my observation of what transpired in that day. And I think that's important for people to be aware of. What were those days like? 1960. It deals with an era. It doesn't deal with beyond 1979. It deals with a period of time from 1964 to 1979. What transpired during that time? That's from my viewpoint, what I noted in it. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jake. Just in closing, I wish to thank the publishers for organizing this event and the panelists for your participation, and those of us who joined, those of you who joined us online. Few Canadians have had the privilege of being in the North and traveling in the North. I count myself very privileged to have been to all these regions and probably most communities in all these regions. And so Canadians don't know how we have worked hard together and respectfully to develop new ways of governing ourselves in a very challenging and some might say harsh, but certainly remote environment, and in a way that sees Aboriginal people recognized and respected. And I'm pleased that even though we're all non-Aboriginals, we focus quite a lot on the importance of that great challenge, which now remains in Canada. So I'm hopeful that this discussion, and for those of you who participated, will be helpful in guiding you in your work and in your views. And I do hope that anyone who hasn't had the opportunity will be interested in reading these books, because I must say I really enjoyed them and was stimulated by them, and I'm very happy to have them in my library. So with that, thank you again, everyone, and I will, as moderator, draw this webinar to a close. Good day, and be safe and be well. Kuya na miralok. Tama.